Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Lydia Cummings. Lydia is a double major in English and writing, and for the past 4 years, it has been a joy to have her in class because of her keen insights into the literature that we read, her skillful writing, and you'll hear some of that today. Not only is Lydia creative in her thinking and writing, but Lydia can also sing. As you may know, she sings with Genevans. And I wouldn't be surprised because she's so talented, if she could also paint and dance and sculpt. Anyway. Well, Lydia does have many gifts. She has intelligence, creativity, service to others, and grace. And I think her presentation today will demonstrate some of these gifts to you. And I must say that I couldn't have been more thrilled to have helped guide Lydia in this project. We had weekly conversations that were rich about the religious poetry of Emily Dickinson and Denise Levertov, and I learned a whole lot from Lydia. And in her study, Lydia directed her attention to the formal aspects of poetry, to the observable and the seemingly insignificant aspects of poetry, like punctuation, and that thrilled me. Also to invisible and inaudible things, like blank spaces and silence. She's going to tell you all about this right now in her paper, which is titled Form and Faith, Blank Space and Spiritual Meaning in the Poetry of Emily Dickinson and Denise Levertov.
Why should we read poetry? And even further, why should we know how to read poetry? Is it important that we understand particular aspects of form, like meter, sound devices, and functions of punctuation? Do these details matter? And if so, why? These are some of the questions that have resonated in my mind as I've worked on this project this semester, and in the past year or so that I've been thinking about some of the material that I plan to discuss. Ultimately, the answer to these questions lies in the connection between form and content. I believe that form has the ability to deeply affect and multiply the meaning of a poem. Understanding how form functions can help us to better understand the poem itself. As Christians, we have a rich poetic heritage. Much of the Bible itself is poetry, so knowing how to read poetry can help us to read scripture in a fuller way. Additionally, a rich tradition of religious poetry exists in both British and American literature, which is worth studying and pondering. Many of these poems deal with issues we face as people of faith and can be of help in working through our own doubts and questions. When people think of religious poetry, if they think of it at all, works like John Donne's Holy Sonnets or George Herbert's shaped poems come to mind. These poets work in closed form, a category which encompasses most traditional poetry written in English. Closed form, for the most part, utilizes organized meter, rhyme patterns, and regular punctuation and sentence structure to express specific themes. In religious poetry, these themes are spiritual or theological, often having to do with doubts, questions, assurances, or praises. Closed form provides a way to eloquently address past faith-related experiences in a controlled space. Traditional closed-form poetry was prevalent in Britain and America through the 19th century and remains popular in some circles today. However, this presentation primarily deals with a different kind of poetry, namely open form. Shifts in the late 19th and 20th centuries led to poetic experimentation. Some poets broke away from the more traditional closed forms and began to experiment with non-traditional formal techniques in open or organic forms. Open form poetry revisits methods of measuring and breaking the poetic line, tends to break out of regular punctuation, and operates outside the constraints of a clearly defined poetic space. While closed form poetry can serve to explore theological and spiritual questions, open form poetry can do the same, especially through the use of line breaks and punctuation. These aspects of open form poetry can serve to highlight blank space, which lends itself to a contemplative form of reading. Empty space, created through poetic devices like line length, punctuation, and white space, can create room for contemplative experience and for mystery to dwell in the poem. Through their work in non-traditional forms, Emily Dickinson and Denise Levertov both explore theological and spiritual questions, paying particular attention to blank space. Dickinson and Levertov use poetic formal techniques, such as line breaks and punctuation, to specifically call attention to blank or open space in their faith-related poetry. These open spaces create room for spiritual contemplation, allowing both the poet and the reader to work through doubts and questions and for the presence of mystery. Open form is much better suited to this kind of exploration and active, in-the-moment wrestling than closed form. In this presentation, I would argue that Dickinson uses dashes to draw attention to space, creating room for contemplation. Levertov does the same with the line and spatial positioning of the canvas. This is specifically illustrated in several of their poems about faith as a thematic. Dickinson's 978, Faith is the Peerless Bridge, and Levertov's The Tide. Each poet makes intentional use of blank space to explore and interact with mystery, doubt, and spiritual questions. In support of this claim, first I will provide a bit of background on Dickinson and her use of dashes, then we will walk through the first poem on your handout together. Next, I will discuss a bit of background on Levertov and her theory of the line to do the same with the second poem on your handout. Emily Dickinson was a 19th century American poet from Massachusetts. She came from a New England Puritan heritage, and though she never made a public profession of faith to join the church, she clearly struggled with issues of faith, based on the vast number of poems and letters she left behind. Dickinson was a reclusive figure and spent much of her life in the same house with the same people. Importantly, she published almost nothing during her lifetime. When she died, her family discovered almost 1,800 poems worth of manuscripts, essentially hidden in her sock drawer. Various editors have since published her work. At first, her poetry was heavily edited and regularized. People thought it strange in its original manuscript form. Dickinson often omitted words for the purpose of compressing lines, making the meaning of many of her poems intentionally ambiguous. She also left out punctuation and used dashes in a very atypical way. In the 1950s, an editor named Thomas Johnson published her work in an attempt to be faithful to the manuscripts, and people were finally able to get a sense of how radical and experimental her use of form was. Since Johnson, Ralph Franklin edited her work in the 90s, and his work is what I used for my study. One of the major controversies in Dickinson's studies regards the dash. In many of her poems, Dickinson included slanting marks, which are usually reproduced as dashes. These marks appear both at the ends of lines and mid-lines. Some critics argue that they are merely a tick of her handwriting and don't really have any significant meaning. Franklin himself falls into this camp. Other critics argue that Dickinson used the dashes as a kind of system to indicate various poetic voices, or some that she used them as a kind of musical notation. Other critics fall somewhere in between these. One scholar, Camilla Denman, comments on dashes in her essay, Dickinson's Volcanic Punctuation. She argues that the dash, quote, disrupts conventional grammatic patterns. It, quote, creates musical and rhythmical effects, and it draws attention to silence. In Denman's view, Dickinson used punctuation, quote, to disrupt and reassemble the relationships between words, end quote. Dashes can be a bridge or a barrier. They can create connections between previously unrelated words or concepts, or they can separate traditionally associated words and concepts. Doing this can create shocking and unexpected meaning, as well as shifting the tone of the poem. Denman claims that, quote, punctuation not only guides meaning, it adds expression and effect to language, end quote. However, Denman also claims that silence is essential for the destructive effect of the dash before the word. She points to how Dickinson moved towards silence in her later years and says that, quote, Dickinson's silence is not a total one, but one filled with rhythm and wordless music, end quote. There is meaning within Dickinson's silence, which she used punctuation to create and draw the reader's attention to, as supported by a comment she made in a letter. Dickinson commented very little on her own work, but there is one instance where she commented on the dash. This letter, written to a friend of Dickinson's, begins with a dash, which Dickinson comments on later in the correspondence. She says, quote, that isn't an empty blank where I began, dash. It is so full of affection that you can't see any, dash. That's all, end quote. This statement implies Dickinson's knowledge of how her dashes could be interpreted. In this case, she clearly intended for the dash to carry meaning, particularly meaning that could not be conveyed through language. Based on this, one could easily conjecture that Dickinson used dashes to a similar effect in her poetry, exploring unspeakable meaning through blank space. Dashes especially help to emphasize silent spaces. The dash allows the reader to play a place to breathe and, quote, creates spaces of silence in the pauses between words, end quote. Specifically, ending dashes open up the poem and point towards the silence. This silence is not empty or meaningless. Denman stresses that for Dickinson, quote, silence is not a void, but rather a fullness from which the most powerful language emerges, end quote. In her poetry, Dickinson uses moments of silence as expressed through her punctuation to dwell, quote, in transcendence, in mystery, and in what cannot be expressed through language, end quote. It is out of these spaces that meaning flows. Powerful and poignant exploration of theological mystery can strongly emerge from poetry which allows, in its very form, for silent spaces of contemplation to exist. In her poem, Faith is the Peerless Bridge, these principles can be seen. I encourage you to follow along with the poem on your handout, as many of the elements I plan to discuss make more sense if seen in addition to being heard. The poem reads as follows. Faith is the peerless bridge, supporting what we see, unto the scene that we do not. Too slender for the eye, it bears the soul as bold as it were wrought in steel, with arms of steel at either side. It joins behind the veil. To what, could we presume, the bridge would cease to be, to our far vacillating feet of first necessity. In Faith is the Peerless Bridge, Dickinson uses the image of a bridge to show how faith shakily connects the seen and the unseen, the earthly and the heavenly, the physical and the spiritual. Poem 978 uses dashes and other punctuation to emphasize and strengthen this claim. Here, dashes act as a visual marker of silent spaces, which serve as connectors between words and lines, and therefore point towards the function of faith that the poem sets out. While there is so much that can be said about this poem, I will focus in this presentation on the 4 dashes that Dickinson includes. 978 contains 4 dashes in total, in lines 1, 3, 7, and 8. The dash in line 1 comes directly after faith, the word of arguably greatest importance in this poem. This placement could be a visual pause, a lengthening of the time spent pondering the word before it. It creates a sense of space around the word faith, setting it apart for special consideration from the rest of the poem. However, the dash here also functions to physically connect faith to the image of a peerless bridge. Faith, the word itself, does not continue in its separation from the image, suspended in silent space. The first dash in the poem functions exactly the way the poem later claims that faith itself does, as a somewhat uncertain bridge, a liminal space of pause which connects word to image. Thus, here, the dash can particularly serve to draw attention to the silent spaces which connect the ironically abstract human to the concrete divine, the God who holds all things together. The second dash appears in line 3. Dickinson commonly used dashes at the end of lines, particularly to end poems. To a degree, dashes placed at the end of a line serve a similar purpose to those placed midline. However, the feeling of suspension and silence grows with this placement. Line breaks can create a similar effect of suspension to dashes, and therefore combining a dash with a line break augments this effect. This dash also works as a visual representation of faith, similar to the first dash. Faith is the peerless bridge, supporting what we see unto the scene that we do not. Dash. Faith bridges the gap between the seen and the unseen, similar to how the second dash literally connects to seemingly blank space. This second dash creates a shaky connection between the first 3 lines and the fourth, too slender for the eye. According to the Dickinson lexicon, the word slender can mean small or insufficient, but it can also mean slight in foundation, lacking justification. This second meaning applies well to the previous lines. Faith is too slight in foundation, like a peerless bridge, too shaky for things seen. Its object cannot be proven with physical evidence. There is a stanza break after this line, which functions to keep the poem's quatrain structure somewhat consistent. Dickinson uses the stanza break to jolt the reader, as lines 4 and 5 could be enjambed. Dickinson places this stanza break in what could be interpreted as the middle of a continuous thought. The lack of punctuation at the end of the 4th line allows for the opportunity to connect this line to the 5th. This bridging would require a leap across the stanza break, a larger blank space. This leap could serve to jolt the reader and create a kind of uncertainty, imitating faith, which, to a certain degree, cannot exist without doubt. The third dash appears at the end of the 7th line, with arms of steel at either side, dash. It functions to create space or pause in a similar fashion to the second dash, being placed at the end of the line. It also serves as a bridge to the 8th line, where the 4th dash is found. It joins behind the veil. Faith joins, as these dashes do. The 4th dash serves to physically join faith to its object, God, who exists in the heavenly realm. The lexicon defines veil as enter the most holy place, to go into the presence of God. In this vein, going behind the veil, biblically, can be representative of entering into the presence of God, like going behind the curtain in the temple or the tabernacle. Faith carries the soul into the presence of God as we are saved through it. The stanza break after the 8th line has a similar effect to the break between the first 2 stanzas. It enjambs the lines. It joins behind the veil to what could we presume. This enjambment between stanzas has a jolting effect. It also creates white space that could be a physical representation on the page of the unseen, the spiritual, the realm behind the veil. This stanza break could be imitating the separation between earth and heaven, between the physical and the spiritual. When faith carries the soul into the presence of God, it is no longer needed. The final 3 lines make this assertion. The bridge would cease to be, to our far vacillating feet, a first necessity. Faith, as established earlier in the poem, is the bridge. The feet, in an example of synecdoche, represent the whole person. They are vacillating, which the lexicon defines as unsteady, stumbling, unstable, hesitating, or wavering, fluctuating, changeable, inconsistent. Therefore, although we may doubt as we walk the bridge of faith, it ceases to be primarily necessary once it is crossed. This statement can be further emphasized by the period in the very last line. Periods are punctuation of certainty, and this is the only one contained in the poem. 978 uses the image of a bridge to illustrate how faith connects the seen and the unseen, the physical to the spiritual, people to God. The dashes in this poem particularly create an effect of pause, liminality, or hesitation by working as a visual bridge between specific words and lines. Dashes here draw attention to the silent spaces, the connected spaces, and in doing so, imitate the outworking of faith in the Christian life. Faith, in the same way the dashes connect words, shakily connects us and God. Without it, we cannot cross the chasm that exists between ourselves and Him. Without it, we cannot be saved. Denise Levertov, in contrast to Dickinson, was a 20th century American poet who worked in open or organic form. She was born in Britain, which is why sometimes the Brits also claim her, and came from a rich religious heritage. Her father was a Russian Jewish rabbi and scholar who converted to Christianity and became an Anglican priest. Her mother was a Welsh Congregationalist. Levertov herself was an agnostic for a portion of her life and eventually came to faith in her middle age, converting to Catholicism. Many of her later poems deal with religious topics. The volume I worked with this semester, The Stream and the Sapphire, exclusively contains poems with religious themes. Levertov relocated to America during a movement towards open form poetry, led by figures like William Carlos Williams and Charles Olson. Levertov began to work with this kind of poetry. Levertov was deeply involved with the publication of her own work and had a lot of authority over how her poems appeared in volumes. Levertov was also a critic in addition to writing poetry and wrote extensively on her own conceptions of poetic formal aspects, particularly the line. Bear with me as I briefly discuss some of these conceptions. In Levertov's poetry, like Dickinson's, form is very closely connected to meaning. As Levertov discusses in her 1965 essay, Some Notes on Organic Form, open or organic forms are exploratory, and poetic structure is intimately connected to content. 20th century poetry, as compared to poetry of the previous century, is, quote, more open-ended, end quote, which is reflective of the state of life for many people during the time. Organic poems flow from the poet's experience in a state of meditation or contemplation. In organic poetry, quote, content and form are in a state of dynamic interaction, end quote. The poetic subject always affects the form, and the form always reflects the poetic subject. In Levertov's view, quote, form is never more than a revelation of content, end quote. Formal aspects can help reveal the meaning of an organic poem. For Levertov, line breaks are the most important aspect of form. In her 1979 essay on the function of the line, Levertov says, quote, there is at our disposal no tool of the poetic craft more important, none that yields more subtle and precise effects than the line break if it is properly understood, end quote. In this essay, she describes her conceptualization of the poetic line, particularly as it pertains to more open forms. Levertov defines line breaks as a kind of, quote, peculiarly poetic, alogical, parallel punctuation, end quote. Line breaks pertain more to rhythm than mathematical metrics in open form. In an essay entitled Listening at the Edge of the Line, a scholar named Mina Gorgi explores various functions of silence created by line endings. She establishes the idea that, quote, the end of the line is figured as a moment of breathing and of listening, end quote, in addition to being a rhythmic, oral, and visual experience. Gorgi specifically discusses silence, quote, not as an absence of sound, but as a strange, unsettled, and unsettled presence, end quote. Silence at the end of a line opens a space for presence to enter. For a person of faith, like Levertov, this could mean creating space for the Holy Spirit, or for actively working through theological questions. Levertov's line breaks can function to reflect her faithful listening, her meditative contemplation. In writing poetry, Levertov enacts her faith. She describes some of these ideas in her 1990 essay, Work That and Faiths. Levertov describes her own faith journey, saying, quote, it was through poetry that I worked through to a theological explanation which satisfied me, end quote. In enacting her calling as a poet, Levertov was able to work through some of her own spiritual and theological doubts and questions. Writing poetry helped her to grow in her faith. In this essay, she also sees her poetry as potentially helpful to readers encountering similar doubts and questions. Engaging the work of a poet struggling through issues of faith can be helpful for readers in working through their own faith journeys. These ideas are illustrated in The Tide, where Levertov directly engages with issues of faith and doubt, similar to Dickinson in 978. She uses line breaks and white space to create a meditative quality which forces the reader to slow down and answer these quandaries for themselves. Please follow along on your handout as I read The Tide. Where is the giver to whom my gratitude grows? In this emptiness, there seems no presence. How confidently the desires of God are spoken of. Perhaps God wants something quite different, or nothing at all. Blue smoke from small, peaceable hearths ascending without resistance in luminous evening air, or eager mornings, waking as if to a song's call. Easily, I can conjure a myriad images of faith. Remote, they pass as I turn a page. Outlying houses and the train's rhythm slows. There's a signal box. People are taking their luggage down from the racks. Then you wake and discover you have not left to begin the journey. Faith's a tide, it seems, ebbs and flows responsive to action and inaction. Remain in stasis, blown sand stings your face, anemones shrivel in rock pools no wave renews. Clean the littered beach, clear the lines of a forming poem, the waters flood inward. Dull stones again fulfill their glowing destinies, and emptiness is a cup and holds the ocean. In The Tide, Levertov compares faith's varying degrees of assurance to the ebbs and flows of tidal patterns. Faith here entails both assurance and doubt, sound and silence, fullness and emptiness. Levertov uses stanza breaks, line breaks, and white space to visually mimic these movements of faith, emphasizing the idea that silence does not mean absence. Rather, silence, emptiness, offers the potential for presence. The Tide, written in a stylistically organic form, which lends to the theme of faith as something. The Tide is written in a stylistically organic form, which lends to the theme of faith as something which naturally ebbs and flows. The lines are metrically irregular, and the stanzas contain a varying number of lines. Each stanza is separated by a visual marker as well as extra white space. Additionally, Levertov offsets stanzas 2 and 4 towards the right, creating additional white space. This offsetting forms the poem into a wave-like shape, which mimics the ebbs and flows of the tide and re-emphasizes the central metaphor of the poem. The poem opens with a question and a statement of doubt. Where is the giver to whom my gratitude grows? In this emptiness, there seems no presence. The speaker is searching for God, feeling as though he is absent. Without God near, the speaker feels spiritually empty. This sense is visually emphasized by line and stanza breaks. The break in the second line after the word emptiness creates a visual representation of the term due to the white space it adds. The stanza break after the third line also has a similar effect. It allows these 3 lines to stand apart as an isolated unit, which could point towards the idea that faith includes individual moments of doubt and assurance at different points in time. The next stanza is offset towards the right and surrounded by white space on either side. This stanza's content shows a slight shift in faith, different from the direct doubt stated in the first stanza. The offset of the second stanza towards the right emphasizes this tonal shift from directly stated doubt to more subtle consideration. The speaker seems to observe others discussing the desires of God in lines 4 and 5. They speak confidently about what he wants or does not want. In lines 6 through 8, the speaker pushes back against this confidence, presenting the alternative that perhaps God wants something quite different, or nothing at all. The speaker seems to be wrestling with the identity and existence of God, who he is and what he wants from us. The last line implies a potential doubt of God's existence. Here, the line of reasoning is, if he exists, he must want something. So if he wants nothing, it is possible that he doesn't exist at all, the ultimate form of absence. However, this statement is uncertain and contemplative, indicative of the state of faith. Faith, at its core, entails both assurance and doubt. The speaker neither directly denies the existence of God, nor directly confirms it. The break after the final line of this stanza heightens this contemplative quality, creating space for these pondering words to resonate and ripple to their many possible conclusions. The third stanza bounces back to the left, beginning the ebb and flow pattern, which creates the tide-like shape of the poem. In this stanza, the speaker has yet another shift in faith, similar to that of the first stanza. The faith in this stanza is one of lackluster despondency, going through the motions without feeling full assurance of God's presence. Levertov begins the stanza by using two images as metaphors of faith, both of which seem to indicate a false sense of ease. Lines 9 through 12 contain the first image. Blue smoke from small, peaceable hearts ascending without resistance in luminous evening air. The image of smoke calls to mind the sacrifices of the Old Testament as statements of faith, actions which, once done, paid for the sin of the Israelites. Smoke from fireplaces floats into the sky without being forced to. Faith, at times, directs worship towards God in the same way, easily and painlessly. The break after line 12 creates a sense of space, dividing it from the following image and allowing the reader time to contemplate the metaphor. Lines 13 and 14 contain the second image. For eager mornings, waking as if to a song's call. The adjective eager personifies these mornings, or the person experiencing them, as earnest and sincere. This personification continues in the next description of their awaking as if they were called by a song. Mornings cheerfully come on their own, similar to the smoke's peaceful rising. Both of these images indicate an ease in practicing faith, which the speaker does not feel. She says in lines 15 through 19, "Easily I can conjure a myriad of images of faith. Remote, they pass as I turn a page." The speaker, seeming to identify as a poet, can come up with any number of images to describe the perceived experience of faith, like smoke and mornings in the previous lines. Easily, here seems to indicate that creating these images and metaphors for faith takes little effort for the speaker, in comparison with the practice of living faith out, which is much more difficult than talking about faith in an abstract sense. The line break after the word faith emphasizes the struggle within the speaker. The space created by this break before the word remote creates a visual representation of this feeling of disconnect. The punctuation here, ending both lines 17 and 19 with a period, augments this remoteness. The stanza ends with the images passing away in indifference, neither relating to the speaker's experience of faith nor contradicting it. The stanza ends with the lines, "They pass as I turn a page." The space after this creates a pause which mimics the action described. Additionally, as printed in the Stream of the Sapphire and on your handout, the turning of a page is required in order to read the rest of the poem. This requirement of the reader to stop and take physical action enlarges the space for contemplative pause. The fourth stanza is offset towards the right, similar to the second stanza. This stanza implicitly draws a metaphor of faith as a train journey. Lines 20 to 23 seemingly describe the end of a train ride into a city. Signs of the destination appear outside the train, the houses, the slowing of the train, and the signal box, as well as on the train, people packing up and gathering their luggage. The line break after luggage mimics the action described, forcing the eyes downward like the suitcases are taken down. At times, faith is assured and makes us feel close to God, the destination of our journey. However, these feelings are not always as they seem, which the next 3 lines indicate. Then you wake and discover you have not left to begin the journey. Even when you are assured and seem to have reached the final destination, you may wake and find yourself back at the very beginning, dealing with doubts and questions and unable to feel God's presence. The last stanza, the longest and most central in many ways, bounces back to the left justification. It reflects on the movement of faith described and illustrated in the previous stanzas. This stanza draws the direct comparison of faith to the tide, from which the poem takes its title and shape. Faith's a tide, it seems, ebbs and flows, responsive to action and inaction. The line break after responsive emphasizes the meaning of these lines. It creates a turn, a response, a change in the poem's shape and flow, just as faith does to life. The period and the line break after inaction illustrates the word, creating a space of stillness between lines. The speaker goes on to describe these 2 states of action and inaction. In lines 29 to 31, inaction is compared to a harsh and lifeless beach. The sibilance in these lines mimics the sound of harsh, sandy wind hitting an object, contributing to the image of passivity. Without the tide of faith, the life of the soul languishes like anemones dying in stagnant rock pools. Perpetuating in a state of inaction, of stillness, only leads to the slow death of the soul. In lines 32 to 34, the speaker describes the opposite state, action. Clean the littered beach, clear the lines of a forming poem, the waters flood inward. The speaker compares shaping a poem to clearing trash from a beach, a form of service done to maintain the environment. Practicing poetry is an action which perpetuates faith for the speaker. It is her calling, and practicing it grows her faith. Levertov put forward this idea in her essay, Work That Inflates. Here she says, quote, "The writing of each of these poems has brought me a little bit closer to faith as distinct from mere shaky belief," end quote. Composing poems like The Tide helped Levertov to work through to a theological explanation which satisfied her. Writing poetry, and more broadly, practicing one's calling, can strengthen a believer's faith. The poem ends with a connection to the first stanza, drawing on the cyclical pattern. Lines 35 to 38 read, "Dull stones again fulfill their glowing destinies, and emptiness is a cup and holds the ocean." The word emptiness appears in the first stanza to describe the speaker's spiritual state, the feeling of God's absence. Here it appears again to describe the same feeling, which the speaker now sees in another light. When the tide of faith floods onto the beach of the soul, it helps to renew, making the soul shine with water. The empty beach fills with the tide, and can only do so because it starts out empty. Rather than viewing emptiness as absence, as she did in the first stanza, the speaker sees it as the potential for presence. It is a cup and holds the ocean. The image of a cup draws on Psalm 23, verse 5. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." Emptiness has the potential to be an overflowing cup, holding the vast presence of God. In conclusion, Emily Dickinson and Denise Levertov use the specific form of their poems to provide space for wrestling with spiritual and theological doubts and questions. Dickinson and Levertov both used poetry to struggle through these faith issues themselves, and in being able to read and understand specific formal aspects of their work, we can do the same. Poetry is worth reading and understanding, both for its beauty and its utility. For believers, reading religious poetry, particularly open-form religious poetry, like that of Dickinson and Levertov, can help us work through our own doubts and questions. Thank you very much for listening.